I want to just share a brief experience, really two very different experiences this week, but rooted with the same idea, the same value that is at the center and core of Torah and at the center and core of who we are as Jews. The first took place on Tuesday. Liba Bayer and Shana Schmidt, on behalf of Congregation Bethel, were representatives with our SOMA Refugee Resettlement Project, partnering with Shari Tefillo Israel and Oheb Shalom Congregation to help resettle an Afghan refugee family in our community, just as we did several years ago when we helped resettle Syrian refugee families into our community. When there is a refugee crisis in this world, we respond, as Torah tells us, by loving the stranger, by welcoming the stranger. Reminder, why? Because we too were once strangers. We open up our hearts and our homes. And so we waited as this family was resettled several weeks ago, got settled in town, got settled in the community. And then the clergy of these three synagogues were invited just to say hello, to welcome Dina and Ali and their daughter Alyssa after leaving Kabul and then spending months in a converted army barrack in South Jersey that was turned into a refugee camp temporarily until these families could be resettled. They told us about sleeping in tents there where ants were crawling all over their things, waiting to be resettled by a community. And then finally, we just wanted to say how grateful we were that they were here and that we could welcome them into our community. And we walked into their home, a home that our community helped furnish, a home that our community is helping to cover the cost of rent and utilities until they get on their feet. And when they opened the door, the smell of the cake that Dina baked for us, and the tea that was whistling, the kettle that was whistling on the stove, I couldn't help but get emotional. They had said to Liba when she greeted them and helped them move in only weeks ago that they had never met Jews before. And weeks later, there were 7 rabbis sitting in their living room having tea and cake, and their 18-month-old daughter kept running into her room and kept bringing each of us a toy, waiting for us to play with her and giggling when we didn't know how to use the toy properly, and handing it to the next rabbi in the room, seeing if we would take up the challenge and the task. This young child, so full of life and energy, you couldn't see in her eyes all that they have been through, but you could in her parents, still so young, highlighting their family who had also relocated to different parts of this country and this continent, and their family who's still there, hoping to be reunited with them soon. Think of that one experience. And then the other experience I had this week where I was having lunch, my friends, with a priest in town, Reverend Sviatoslav Hot, who's the Reverend at the Ukrainian Orthodox Church right down the road from us on Irvington Avenue in Maplewood, a church that I'm sure many of us may have seen as we were sort of making our way through Irvington and Orange and Newark and Maplewood and then South Orange, getting off the Parkway. But because it's on the edge of town, it's maybe not a church that any of us have ever been to before in any of our interfaith efforts. And over lunch, he was telling me about how his father and his brother were on the front lines right now, fighting for their freedom, for their independence, for their country. And showing me on his phone that they get their news not from any the news media that we look to, but he showed me this WhatsApp chat with every Ukrainian he knows who's still there in their country, posting video after video of their homes being destroyed, of what it's like in their metro stations that were converted to bomb shelters because they were just seeking safety underground. And asked for our community's help so they could send goods to Ukraine. It was the idea that even if they had money to go to the stores were shuttered. The stores weren't getting supplies shipped in. Asking for warm clothes and non-perishable foods, and flashlights and candles and first aid supplies. And the church was having every night this week a service for peace, a prayer service in hopes that Russia's invasion of Ukraine will end. And so I went to church on Thursday nights, and Reverend Holtz showed me that in 72 hours, the basement of their church was full of supplies that our larger community, when they got word they were in need and our desire to help the most vulnerable, started dropping off at their church. And he told me in tears as how their efforts to provide relief to their friends and family there have shifted. That Russia was blocking most humanitarian aid from coming into the country. The only thing that they were letting to be brought in was medical supplies. But all the clothing that was donated was now being shifted to Poland and Romania, where close to 1.5 million Ukrainians walked across the borders and are now seeking refugee status in those countries just a week into the attack there. I remember when we resettled Syrian refugee families and we were told that this is the greatest refugee crisis since World War II. And then we feared something similar when individuals started quickly, immediately, as fast as they could, being airlifted and evacuated from Afghanistan. And now, numbers tell us the same may be true for Ukrainians seeking shelter and safety, leaving their own country. We're not told more times than any other commandment in our Torah to believe in God. We're not told more times than any other commandments to keep kosher or to keep the Sabbath day, to put seats on the four corners of our garments. We're told more times than any other obligation to love and welcome the sojourner. Because we've been there, because our families have experienced the same, and because we understand that home is only home temporarily until somebody decides that it's not our home anymore. This week's Torah reading, we complete the building of the Mishkan, the temporary portable sanctuary the Israelites brought with them in the wilderness. And when that tabernacle was completed, we're told that God's presence, Kavod Adonai, Malet HaMishkan, filled up the entire space. The idea of the tabernacle was a brilliant one. They would break it down, and each person among the Israelites would carry a piece of it until they moved on to their next temporary home, and they rebuild it. And then when they were ready to move on again, they break it down once again, bring it with them, and then rebuild it. And so on and so forth throughout their 40 years of wandering. The idea was that no matter where they were, as long as they felt a sense of home, as long as they were able to bring this tabernacle with them, they were home. And so that is our job and that is our task. How can we help refugee families, the most vulnerable in this world right now, feel at home when they're forced to leave their homes. That is our task as human beings. That is our holy task as Jews. We hope, with our community support, to be able to continue to resettle Afghan refugee families, and we know and believe that in the coming weeks, there will be many Ukrainian refugee families that will be looking to come here as well. We wish that they could remain in their country peacefully, but as I said, for 1.5 million already, they have left. Efforts on the ground with the JDC, the Joint Distribution Committee, supported by Jewish Federation, is working to help support the Jewish families in Odessa and in Kyiv and throughout Ukraine, the third largest, arguably some statisticians suggest, the third largest Jewish community in the world outside of America and Israel is Ukraine. If you ask a Chabad rabbi, they'll tell you that there's close to 1 million Jews there, just most don't identify. It's probably closer to 400,000 or 500,000, depending on how we identify who is a Jew. Or at least it was up until about 2 weeks ago. Those Ivy Hill apartments right down the road, just a few decades ago, were where our community works to help resettle so many Jews from the former Soviet Union when they fled seeking persecution, religious safety, and security. And so we stand as we celebrate providing a home and helping this young Afghan family and their 18-month-olds feel safe and secure and at peace. We're ready as a community to continue doing so for so many other families, because as the Torah tells us, wherever a family calls home, it is our job to help build their tabernacle for them. It's our job to help them feel safe and secure. And as long as we do that holy work, Kavod Adonai Malet HaMishkan, God's presence will fill up whatever space they reside in, their homes, and God willing, protect them. Amen.